16 million. According to the American Journal of Human Genetics, 2003, 16 million men alive today carry a nearly identical Y chromosome tracing directly to the Mongol expansion. To comprehend that staggering statistic, we must abandon the victor's perspective and look through the eyes of the defeated. For the women of fallen cities, the daughters of deposed lords, the wives of vanquished generals, the sisters of silenced kings, the Mongol conquest was an inescapable reality. We can imagine the profound disorientation as their royal houses were emptied, their ancient lineages severed, their cultural archives burned, their societal ranks erased, and their futures permanently bound to the men who dismantled their world. Everything they knew simply ceased to exist. They did not face bizarre, sensationalized rituals invented by modern internet myths, but rather a vast, cold machine of demographic assimilation. If you've been waiting for someone to separate the real history from the clickbait, you're exactly where you need to be. The gates broke, the defensive walls fell, the local garrisons were systematically eliminated, the regional leaders were silenced permanently, the wealth of centuries was cataloged, the royal households were dismantled. To a noblewoman of a fallen empire, this sequence felt like the chaotic end of the world. It was not chaos, it was administration. Here is the central truth that reshapes everything we understand about the Mongol expansion. The internet is flooded with fabricated lists of sensational, grotesque bedroom practices forced upon captured women. Those lists are modern fictions. The historical reality was a highly organized, deliberate, and entirely unsentimental bureaucratic strategy. The Mongol High Command did not waste time on bizarre theatricality. They used systematic demographic engineering to permanently dismantle rival dynasties. According to Atta Malik Juvaini in History of the World Conqueror, the aftermath of a city's fall involved a strict and methodical division of the surviving populace. Juvaini wrote as a Persian administrator under Mongol rule, and while he details the conquest's impact on local populations, his work can contain narrative exaggerations typical of Persian historical traditions. Despite these narrative flourishes, historians agree based on his accounts that the distribution of captive women was never a random free-for-all, but a calculated mandate dictated from the top down. The women of the highest status, the wives and daughters of the defeated elite, were purposefully selected to become concubines or secondary wives to high-ranking Mongol commanders. It is staggering to consider the absolute efficiency of this machine. The Secret History of the Mongols explicitly documents how Genghis Khan and his successors used the distribution of captive women to reward loyal generals and enforce military cohesion. As the principal native Mongol source, it frequently glorifies the conquests and focuses on Genghis Khan's lineage, demanding a critical reading regarding the harsh realities of power dynamics and cultural subjugation. Evidence points to a rigid system where claiming a captured noblewoman was both a public display of rank and a mechanism to absorb the political legitimacy of the vanquished state. Historians debate the primary motivation behind this specific mechanism of assimilation. One camp argues it was a calculated method of psychological dominance, meant to entirely break the spirit of resisting nations by absorbing their highest-ranking women. The opposing camp maintains it was purely pragmatic, a way to quickly bind the empire together with households that held deep local administrative knowledge. Regardless of the motive, from the perspective of the defeated, the transition was total. We can imagine the profound shock of a conquered princess standing in an encampment, watching imperial administrators tally human beings like grain, realizing that her new purpose was to give birth to the next generation of the men who just erased her civilization. There were no sadistic rituals. There was only the cold mechanics of systemic integration. She would be placed in a commander's household, She would be stripped of her former political autonomy. She would be assigned a strict hierarchical role beneath the commander's primary Mongol wives. She would be expected to produce heirs. Her royal heritage was weaponized against her own people. The Mongols recognized that standing armies could eventually be defeated, but biology could not be undone. By forcing the integration of foreign nobility into their own military households, they ensured that within a single generation, the descendants of the conquerors and the descendants of the conquered were exactly the same people. Atamalik Juvaini, the Persian administrator who chronicled the empire in his History of the World Conqueror, carefully documented the immediate aftermath of a city's fall. Writing as an official under Mongol dominion, his accounts carry an inherent bias, often framing the conquests as divine destiny while softening the brutal realities faced by the local populations. Yet, even through his diplomatic prose, a chilling administrative process emerges. When the defensive walls collapsed and the organized resistance ended, the Mongol commanders did not descend into chaotic, lawless rampages of mythical rituals. Instead, they dispatched clerks. They set up tables in the ruined plazas. They gathered the surviving nobility. They separated the skilled artisans from the aristocrats. They evaluated the physical and political worth of the highest-ranking women. They recorded names, origins, and bloodlines on administrative scrolls, a quiet ledger. We can imagine the profound disorientation of a Khwarezmian noblewoman standing in the dust of her conquered city, watching imperial bureaucrats tally her family members like livestock. She would realize in that suffocating moment that the violence was over, but the machinery of her subjugation was just powering up. She was no longer a person. She was a unit of demographic wealth. This brings us to the core reality of the Mongol assimilation engine, the central conclusion that dismantles every sensationalized internet myth about sadistic games. The Mongol war machine did not capture foreign women merely as a spoil of war. They utilized forced, highly structured concubinage as a deliberate, systematic mechanism to culturally and genetically overwrite the defeated elite, transforming the wombs of conquered women into the very foundation of their expanding empire. The entire system was designed to ensure that the defeated could never rise again. If we understand this central conclusion, we must spend our time looking at exactly how this demographic displacement was executed on the ground. The reality was far more terrifying than any fictionalized ritual, because it was completely normalized. The 2003 American Journal of Human Genetics published a peer-reviewed study analyzing the genetic legacy of the Mongols, mapping a specific Y chromosome lineage that spread rapidly across Eurasia during the empire's height. While biologically rigorous, this data is heavily reliant on modern distributions and requires careful historical contextualization. Popular culture often uses this study to marvel at the legendary virility of Genghis Khan and his immediate descendants. But when we view this data through the lens of the losers, the map transforms. It is no longer a map of conquest. It is a map of systematic erasure. Every single genetic marker representing that expanding Mongol lineage simultaneously represents a local lineage that was permanently halted. Geneticists and anthropologists agree that the rapid dissemination of this specific chromosome was only possible through a highly organized, socially enforced system of unequal reproduction. The women carrying the descendants of the conquerors were, overwhelmingly, the captured daughters, wives, and sisters of the defeated political classes. They were absorbed into the Ordo, the mobile command camps that served as the socio-economic heart of the Mongol military. The historical records are silent on the exact emotional breaking points of these captives, but we can picture the grueling reality of their new existence. Transported hundreds of miles from temperate palaces to the unforgiving, wind-scoured plains of the steppe, the environment alone was a form of extreme treatment. They were placed into sprawling felt tents, entering a complex, rigid hierarchy where their previous royal titles meant absolutely nothing. They bowed to the principal Mongol wives who controlled the household wealth. They managed the lower-tier captives who tended the herds. They served the commanders who had commanded the violent ends of their former husbands. They bore children who would grow up speaking a foreign tongue, total compliance. We are looking at the raw, uncomfortable mechanics of how empires are actually built, stripping away the myths to see the staggering human cost beneath. If stories like this one, the kind history tried to erase, are what brought you here, Beneath the Crown releases a new investigation every week. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I am Sebastian, and there is always a deeper truth waiting in the shadows. Historians remain fiercely divided on the primary intent behind the architecture of the Ordo. One camp argues that this structure was a masterpiece of psychological warfare. By seizing the highest-ranking women of a conquered nation and forcing them into the households of the commanding generals, the Mongols shattered the foundational morale of the occupied territory. The message was unmistakable. Your most untouchable elites now serve our daily needs. The opposing camp insists the motive was purely pragmatic. The Mongols were a nomadic minority, attempting to govern a vast, sedentary world. They desperately needed the administrative literacy, the cultural knowledge, and the local political legitimacy that these aristocratic women possessed. The secret history of the Mongols. The principal native source regarding the empire's rise frequently glorifies this process. The text emphasizes the expansion of the ruling lineage and frames the acquisition of foreign brides as a testament to the conqueror's divinely mandated supremacy. However, we must critically navigate this source. It was written to validate the power of the ruling family, deliberately ignoring the coercion, the profound grief, and the loss of autonomy experienced by the subjugated women. In the Mongol narrative, a captured princess was elevated by her inclusion in the Khan's household. For the captive herself, the transition was a slow, methodical stripping of identity. Scholars studying the inner workings of the Mongol camps note that the hierarchy was inescapable. A captured woman's status was entirely dependent on her ability to integrate, produce heirs, and navigate the treacherous internal politics of the Ordo. She was not subjected to bizarre, sensationalized bedchamber trials. Her worth was measured in practical utility and biological output. If a woman of high birth showed administrative skill, she might be entrusted with managing the logistics of a secondary camp. If she failed to adapt, she faded into the anonymous background of the massive military retinue. They memorized the unfamiliar lineages of their captors. They adopted the heavy felt garments of the steppe. They learned to speak in the tongue of the men who orchestrated the systematic elimination of their fathers and brothers. They surrendered their past, a permanent exile. Returning to Giovanni's History of the World Conqueror, we find meticulous records of how the Khwarezmian royal women were distributed after the empire's collapse. Giovanni, balancing his Persian heritage with his loyalty to his Mongol employers, describes the transfer of these noblewomen almost as if it were a standard diplomatic exchange. He lists the princesses sent to the courts of Genghis Khan's sons and the noblewomen granted to high-ranking generals as rewards for military success. He sanitizes the coercion. He omits the despair. We can imagine the chilling silence inside those transport caravans as they moved east across the mountains. The women inside were not bound in chains, nor were they facing arbitrary execution, but they were trapped in a cage of inescapable socio-political reality. They knew that their bodies were now the vessels through which a new aristocracy would be forged. Their children would not be Khwarezmian. Their children would be the Mongol overlords of the next generation. This was the true power of the assimilation engine. The Mongols understood a fundamental reality of empire that many before them had missed. You can burn a city to ash, but ashes can be cleared and stones can be rebuilt. You can scatter a standing army, but descendants will eventually raise new banners. To permanently conquer a civilization, you must conquer its future. By systematically distributing the noblewomen of defeated nations into the commanding households of their own military, they ensured that any future rebellion was biologically impossible. The sons who would theoretically have the royal bloodline required to lead a revolt against the empire were, in fact, the very same sons who stood to inherit the empire itself. It was a masterstroke of demographic engineering. When we look back at the central conclusion that forced assimilation was a deliberate administrative tool, the sheer scale of the operation evokes a dark, unsettling wonder. It requires us to comprehend a level of human organization so vast and so relentlessly efficient that it forever altered the ethnic makeup of the Asian continent. The commanders did not need to invent elaborate, disgusting rituals to demean their captives. The mechanics of the empire were humiliating enough. They took the daughters of kings. They placed them in tents. They erased their nations. An irreversible shift. 16 million. According to a 2003 peer-reviewed study in the American Journal of Human Genetics, approximately 16 million men across Eurasia today carry an identical Y chromosome lineage. The scientific consensus strongly links this genetic marker to the male ruling house of the Mongol Empire. It is a biological footprint so vast it challenges human comprehension. It forces us to stand in awe at the sheer demographic gravity of a single political machine. But the Y chromosome only tells half the story. It only tracks the fathers. What about the mothers? Look at this history through the eyes of the defeated. The secret history of the Mongols documents the systematic absorption of rival tribes, the Tatars, the Merkits, the Karaites. When these factions fell, their elite women were immediately assimilated into the highest Mongol households. Juvayni's History of the World Conqueror details how this immense administrative process was later applied outward to vast agrarian empires, creating a continent-wide network of demographic engineering. The captive noblewomen watched their cities burn. They saw their fathers and brothers meet a violent end. They were transported across frozen steppes. They were placed in the tents of the men who had orchestrated their ruin. We can imagine the absolute silence of those first winter nights, stripped of their titles, stripped of their homelands, stripped of their futures, isolated in a sprawling mobile military camp surrounded by foreign guards. The loss of their borders, the loss of their language, the birth of children who belonged entirely to the military state, the complete systematic elimination of their past. And then the system collapsed upon its own logic. The Mongol administrative engine was designed to erase foreign nobility. Historians suggest that by making these women the mothers of the next generation, the commanders believed they were permanently neutralizing any threat of rebellion. But they critically miscalculated the mechanics of their own society. In Mongol culture, senior wives held immense, undeniable authority. They managed the camp. They distributed the wealth. They controlled the supply lines. The secret history of the Mongols repeatedly highlights the political leverage wielded by women within the ruling elite, showing that a commander's camp was entirely his wife's domain when he rode to war. The captured women of the defeated nations did not remain passive hostages. They adapted. They became the managers of the largest logistics network on Earth. They raised the heirs. They controlled the flow of goods. They shaped the political alliances of their sons. The conquerors had unknowingly brought the most educated, politically astute women of the defeated nations directly into the center of Mongol power. The secret history of the Mongols records multiple instances where assimilated women actively directed the decisions of the highest-ranking leaders. They were forced into a coercive system of extreme assimilation, yet they learned to operate its levers. They turned captivity into administration. The very engine built to erase their legacy became the vehicle for their survival. Evidence points to a striking reality. Within 2 generations, the empire was largely being managed, influenced, and culturally steered by the daughters of the conquered. The commanders thought they had conquered the future, but that future was being raised, educated, and molded by the women they had taken by force. If you were a captive queen tasked with raising the son of your captor, would you teach him the ways of his father or the memory of your fallen people? Every week on Beneath the Crown, Sebastian exposes the quiet truths hiding behind sensationalized myths. If witnessing the actual survival tactics of these women shifted your perspective, subscribe, and we will keep dismantling history's distortions. A like tells the algorithm that real historical endurance deserves to outshine manufactured shock value. But the demographic shifts these women engineered did not stop in the steps. The next investigation follows exactly where this genetic legacy leads, and it is waiting for you now. They endured forced assimilation, they navigated inflexible command structures. They reshaped the largest logistics network on Earth from the inside out, until captivity became control. The secret history of the Mongols confirms these women held absolute administrative power over the camps of their captors. Corroborating the demographic data mapped in the American Journal of Human Genetics, evidence points to a reality where their quiet political maneuvering steered the empire just as heavily as the cavalry. We will never know the forbidden lullabies they whispered to their sons in the dark, preserving erased cultures under the very roofs of the conquerors. We do not need invented internet myths to make this history imposing. The reality of their assimilation is profound enough. They did not just survive the collapse of their nations, they raised the future. I am Sebastian. This is Beneath the Crown.